Welcome back, guys. Welcome to episode 5. We have a fantastic episode here for you, all about pod tuning. We have our topic for the day, and we also have a viewer question, which we will get into right now.
Victory's calling, it's racing time. The spinning pinion takes the crown. Fast and furious, round and round.
Oh, God.
Rush, the speed's dominion. Welcome to the world of the spinning pinion.
Welcome back, guys. Thanks again. Just a quick reminder, please like and subscribe, and also feel totally welcome to leave a comment down below if there's a topic that you want discussed or if there's any questions you have. And then also, I just wanted to give a big shout out to Dennis Brown for winning the ScaleAuto GT3 car. Your car is going to be in the mail today, so keep an eye out for that. I'll send you a tracking number and you can watch it as it makes every step of the way towards Southern California, which I'm sure you're very excited about. So Todd, what is our topic today?
The topic today is pod tuning. How to achieve peak performance with pod tuning.
How to peak performance with pod tuning.
How to achieve peak performance with pod tuning.
I just wanted to say as many P words as possible. It's all right. We never said this show was supposed to be intelligent. So, how to achieve maximum performance with pod tuning. Where should we even begin with that? Maybe we should talk about our evolution of the understanding of pod tuning.
I think, really the story of you and I starting to work together was primarily a story of pod tuning.
Yes.
In terms of just massively different concepts of pod tuning, and how did we both essentially merge those together, because we liked the pros of the other one, but we both had cons about the way our pods were set up. So this dates back to ScaleAuto 2023, when you and I really started talking, and at that race kind of started seeing each other's setups. For anyone that watched that race, that is the showdown between Ian and Herman and the Bassis brothers in the Enduro, Bassis brothers drove a car that I had tuned. And really at the time, my pod setups were generally fully tight. Front and rear, the pod was tight, had a lot of grip, and you had a really direct feel with the car, but it didn't have a lot of forgiveness, right? So the car could bite you.
Yeah.
And you couldn't really feel sneaking up on that line. Why don't you talk a little bit about your setup, kind of going into that race?
Yeah, so that was kind of back when I was just starting. I think that was our second race. That wasn't our second race. It was our third race at Electric Dreams, because we had the 22 Nationals, the 22 Enduro, the Christmas Enduro, and then this was kind of like our first race back, and it was the first year of ScaleAuto. So, we didn't really know what to do with these cars. We had just come off the back of, like I said, Slot It, and at Slot It we ran the pod. I ran the pod very loose. It just kind of went around, had tons of movement. We ran the slotting plus screws. So I thought, I'm just going to run the slotting plus screws again in this car. And, I've since changed this pod, but this car, the pod movement was insane. You can actually watch the Electric Dreams video, but the pod just moved everywhere. It
moved equally in every direction, horizontally, right? So it didn't have any vertical movement.
Correct.
But the pod moved completely freely, and you had the same screws front and back, so it moved the same horizontal, forward back distances at all 4 screws.
Yep, and I only had 4 screws, so it was even less limited than we run them now. And that car was, as we described, the opposite of your car. Your car, I would watch the car that you prepared with the Bassis brothers, and it would go around the track, and it would just you could just see it right on the edge where it just had so much grip, and they were just railing corners with that car. But then all of a sudden it would just poof, just totally de-slot. And so it would, like you said, it would catch you out. Whereas mine was you could go into the corner really, really deep. And then coming out of the corner, you really had to be gentle on the car. And so you could see what was coming from a mile away. And the car would err on the side of loose on corner exit. But man, the way it went into the corners was just amazing. Yeah. And that's where I made, that car was very Max Verstappen-y, where it was super pointy and it would rotate. And hey, there was a little emoji.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why was that on your camera?
I don't know. So that car was really pointy. It was very Max Verstappen-y. It would rotate really, really well, but then it was really hard to push. And Herman
Yeah.
found that out the hard way. And so, I think after that race, you and I both thought, why can't we have both? And it was just a weird random question. It wasn't like we didn't think about the
It was a
viability
question
of it.
that when we first talked about it seemed like impossible. I
Yeah.
remember saying like you were convinced that we could get the best of both worlds, and I was like, I don't know how we do that. Like there's going to be a compromise one way or the other, and I think where we ended up was um, actually better almost in all areas. I think one of the things I want to bring up though as we go through this is you've got a few different turn styles that those cars worked really well in, right?
Hmm.
And this is something you and I talk about a lot as far as like being able to push a car because a car set up like your car where it's fully loose like that in the horizontal plane, you're going to have a ton of entry forgiveness. Like you said, you can get like most of the way into the turn before you hit the brakes because you're
Yeah.
delaying that weight transfer, right? Yeah, so I think in the large radius turns is where you really saw a massive difference in what we define as like being able to push a car, right?
Hmm.
So your car being fully loose in the horizontal plane, when you would push your car in a large radius turn, it would really kind of freak out. It didn't like being pushed. It kind of wanted to go one speed through that,
Yeah.
and then you could get back on it. It was great in the really tight turns, a lot of exit speed. It was really forgiving. You could brake really deep, but you kind of had to drive your car the way it wanted to be driven. And, for a fully tight setup, right, you have that really direct feel in a large radius turn, but you lose all that forgiveness on a really tight turn. And the cars are way more prone to traction rolling, and you really can't feel where that line is, right?
Yeah, and I think that it's important to also tell people, our theories on why those characteristics are happening. And I think that you said something about it, which is that it's the transition of the weight on the car. And I think even at like an even more simple basic level, it's like the pod transitioning and having a hard stop on a side of the car. So, you are, when you get into the corner, the front end of the car is starting to track around the corner and the rear of the pod is able to sort of float in. But once that pod hits its maximum internal, because the thing is that the rear wheels are going to track inside of the corner. So basically, it's coming through the corner. This is actually going to come down. And then once you start it coming through the corner, it's going to slam potentially out. And that sudden transition is what is kind of breaking the car away, right? And so having the pod fully tight eliminates all of the sudden transitions, but it puts an extreme demand on the tire grip. And so what you're achieving is
Very
yeah.
suddenly, it puts an extreme demand on the tire grip.
Yeah. I mean, because if we're thinking about it, the contact patch of the tires is, no more than, just like a little tip. It's like just like half of an eraser. And so once you get into a corner and you are at the limit of adhesion and then you break that, it's gone. Right. And so the loose pod was able to float there and provide some corner entry forgiveness. Yeah, continue, please. I don't want
No,
to get too
I think
derailed, but
that's important to talk about. So there's a few things going on there, right? One, you've got the pod hitting the end of its travel. In a loose
yeah,
setup, you're always going to have the pod hitting the end of that travel, and it's going to build up to that, right? Because it has nothing slowing it down. So yeah, you have a delay in all that weight transfer, but when that weight transfer all hits, it hits all at once and really abruptly.
yeah,
And so in a short turn, you're really out of the turn before that happens, and you're already kind of straight and on the gas. In a large radius turn, every time you push that, that pod could be doing different things, it has no resistance and no direction on its movement. And that's the other key thing that we really kind of figured out through this, right? Is the angle that you're achieving with that pod in those turns is also critical.
mm-hmm,
You want that pod to be forced into an advantageous angle, meaning a position that helps the car to turn. And when you have, like when you had at ScaleAuto, where all four screws had the same amount of travel that they could do, that pod had no, you weren't telling that pod where to go, right? That
Yeah.
you were at the mercy of however that pod wanted to travel. And that's actually one of the things that when we got to slotted nationals that year, that we ended up really figuring out with those cars, because oddly enough, I think it's the only car of like any of the ones that we've gotten to like a good setup on now where we still run all four screws fully loose. But
Yeah.
the key difference in how we run it is that we use NSR screws in the front that have a much thicker stem, and we use the slotted screws in the back that have a really thin stem, so the back's able to move much more than the front. When you get into a turn, then that pod is forced into an angle that
An
helps the
advantageous
car through the
angle.
turn. Yeah.
Yep.
And so that's the other thing. And you know, you and I have had a lot of conversations about this. I've got a little more, some in-depth kind of theories on that, but at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you're forcing that pod into an angle that's going to be beneficial for you. And I think that's, you know, just as important as like whether or not there's movement. It's what is the car allowed to do with that movement.
Yeah. And I think that it's also important to note that while this has been proven to work on other tracks, it's not a there's no just guaranteed performance tuning methodology in slot cars, right? I mean, everything that we think we know, knowing things is a very dangerous mindset because it eliminates our sort of openness to thinking outside the box and thinking about other ideas. And so, you know, this is our theory about how this is working, and it works exceptionally well on wooden tracks. And I think you've proven it worked really well on the polycar track as well. But who's to say it works the same on a Carrera track or, you know, or whatnot. So it's not like an absolute rule, but it's definitely like a great starting point for I think most people.
Well, and I think the important thing there too is like, you know, we even got into it a little bit talking about like the Sonic cars, right? They, you know, the same thing like we've done with tires, right? You kind of end up coming up with a spectrum of setups that you know generate like more grip or less grip or more forgiving or less forgiving. And when you get to a track, understanding the adjustments that you can make to the pod to change the car's behavior is massive, because you could copy a setup that we have and you could watch it. You know, I've had people ask me about setups on that Marco's done episodes on the Electric Dreams YouTube page, and it might be a completely inappropriate setup for even the track conditions we race now, because so much has changed there with the non-magnetic braid.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding like where you go for like a baseline setup and then how do you adjust that from there, I think is also, you know, is where you should hope to get, and not going into it thinking this has to be the pod setup, and if it doesn't work there must be something wrong with the car.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that you hit on something really intelligent, which is that, you know, having those ideas and those concepts and knowing how the pod reacts, or just the tuning methodologies, right? Like, I think a lot of people set up a car. It does kind of tie into the whole magic car thing where people get a car working and they don't know why. And I think one of the things that we've been able to do really well is at Electric Dreams, at these big races, at Motown, wherever we go, we have these ideas in our head. We have this tuning methodology where we can go and we can identify what's the grip level, what kind of corners are there, what's the car characteristics, and we can literally within a day get the car, I'd say 85-90% of the way dialed, just because we have that experience having done this exercise of taking the cars from both ends and then combining them. We now understand, like, what does a tight pod do? What does a loose pod do? What do these different screws do? I think while some may consider it kind of like maybe it's like a little bit of a black art or like an art. It's like maybe there's a little mystery behind it, but like in reality, it's all rooted in this pod geometry, which was what you're talking about.
Well, and also the car behavior, right? So exactly what we were just talking about with where's the car failing? Where's the car either not forgiving or, you know, really hard to push?
Yeah.
And, you know, looking at that, I think will tell you a lot. Is the car traction rolling in a sharp turn? Then you probably have too much immediate grip, and delaying some of that would probably be better. Maybe your pod's set up tight and you should loosen it a bit.
Yeah.
And when we say loosen in general, we're not talking about for wood track. And again,
We're talking
we got to
about,
specify it's wood track, but we're not talking about vertical travel. You know, I hear people all the time talk about like, oh, I have this, you know, a half turnout or a full turnout. And I don't even honestly think about in terms of like how many turns a screw is out. I will sit there with the screw and loosen it like a
Feel it.
1/32 of a turn and feel, okay, is it moving without binding anywhere?
Yeah.
And that should be
Like,
a, smooth movement. And then you just go until it's like really free moving, but it's not going to have, yeah, much at all in terms of vertical travel,
one of
because
my
that's what
favorite
you're letting the chassis do that work
Mhm.
essentially.
One of my favorite sort of tests while holding these cars is to hold both tires like this and then basically try to twist it, and you feel the screws if there's just like a little bit of a click in there, right? And it moves side to side perfectly fine, but there's none of this.
Yeah.
So what that's doing is it's tying the pod to the chassis and allowing them both to work together to have that torsion, right? And that's equaling a certain level of traction.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's allowing the car to work, the pod to work with the chassis. And yeah, I think there's, depending on the car you're using, then there are other ways to kind of further enhance that, right? So like you're holding up a ScaleAuto car there. And one of the big things we did in 2024 and then this last year also was use the side pod screws because they have a 6-point pod. You can run the extensions and run it as a 6-point pod. And so those side screws, I was using those side screws. They weren't really for anything other than how tightly the pod adhered to the chassis. Because that pod in those cars is so stiff, using those screws and allowing the chassis to flex more or tightening them up a little bit and allowing it to flex less was basically the way that we were tuning the way the car would transition, the way it would slide.
Mm-hmm.
And
So,
so, you do have to look at different cars a little bit differently depending on what adjustments you have available to you.
yeah.
You know, understanding like where the screws are located in relation to the rear axle, I think is a very big one because it changes how the car will respond to different screw settings.
Yeah, and I also think to the earlier point we made, when I've in the past, one of my difficult learnings or painful learnings was that people would ask me to set cars up for them. And for a couple of years there, like at Slot It particularly, I would set up cars and they would be like an absolute duplicate of my car. But the thing is that not everyone feels confident in certain characteristics of a car. And so there's a danger in copying someone else's setup because, I have a friend who shall remain nameless, but I built him a car and we went to Slot It and he was just like, I can't drive. Like this car is too loose. It's too loose. It's too loose. And it's like, this car is the same as mine. But the way that he drives, he needs more entry stability. And so, he would have benefited from a tighter pod than me, who I drive, I'm a third into the corner before I'm even braking, and he brakes before the corner and he's trying to load the car and go through the corner. And, I obviously think that my way is pretty good and pretty fast, but there's also like value to other ways to drive a slot car. And you need to make sure that you tune the car for you and not necessarily tune the car based on like what someone else is telling you to do.
Well, and also, right, like understanding if you're making a change to a car for a certain reason, maybe for entry forgiveness, then
Yeah.
you might also have to adjust your driving style a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Because I remember setting up a Viper like identical to yours after we started talking just to see, right? I wanted to see
You
how does
wanted the
this really
torture.
drive? And you could drive that thing so deep into the turns and you had to really change how you drove. You couldn't really push it. You had to wait till it was all the way out. But those exit speeds were so high.
Yeah.
And I mean, you now I go back and I can watch that race and see like, oh man, this car is coming out of the turns really, really fast. It didn't need to be pushed. You just had to kind of
Carry the speed.
nudge it through
Exactly.
the whole lap. Why don't we talk a little bit then about how we merged those two concepts, right? So what did we change to get our cars to kind of have the best of both worlds? And it's kind of a story in a couple different phases, right? We operate under a lot of different rule sets, right? So some of our classes are a lot more open, like the Scale Auto class. Some of them
Yeah.
are a lot more restricted. Slotted, honestly, I think Slotted and NSR are both pretty spec classes
Yeah.
that you can't do a whole lot to the cars. It's part of what I think makes those races so great for
Popular.
to
Yeah.
most people. But we originally started with the Scale Auto Viper, right? And that's how we were trying to merge this concept. And what we ultimately came to is that we talk about the pod hitting the end of that travel was that we needed to slow that down. We needed to do two things. We needed to slow it down and we needed to give it some direction and force it into an advantageous position. And so it really kind of morphed into what we did to that car and then what we took and how we did that in a more restricted rule set. So with the Viper, right, we started using, that's where we came up with the O-ring concept around the heads of the screws. And we were using those to slow the pod movement down. So like I have a Viper here, but I do have one line of weight. It's missing an O-ring, but you can see that it's got the O-rings on the side here.
Jeez.
And so when you move this, it's got some spring to it, right? But it's going in an advantageous direction. And so this car especially is one that it's got all that entry forgiveness, right? When you're in a sharp turn, it's going to put more force through those. There you go. That's like the original sketch, I think.
Yeah.
I think you sent me that sketch and that's where
Yeah.
So in a sharp turn, it's going to put more force through those O-rings, flex them or compress them a little bit more and give you more angle. And the car will give you that entry forgiveness. And then you get all the way out of the turn before you're really hitting the gas. On a larger radius turn, because then you've got that resistance, you're not putting as much force into that O-ring and compressing it as much. You've got that more direct feel where you can push the car. It kind of ends up becoming the best of both worlds, right? And it's just an exercise in slowing down that pod movement. So when we got to NSR and we think, how do we do this with an NSR Mosler
Without O-rings.
with the triangular pod without O-rings because we couldn't use any suspension and that's technically considered suspension. How do we achieve the same thing? And what we really came up with is like really locking down that front screw, like really, really tight on the front screw and then loose in a horizontal plane on the rear screws. And in effect, then you're using the flexing of that pod as your spring to slow that weight down. And that, while it may not work as perfectly as doing a more complicated solution, that's a really simple way of implementing that I think, makes the car far more drivable, gives it a balance between tight and large radius turns, and gives you that direct feel when you want it and the forgiveness. And it really ended up being kind of the best of both worlds that we didn't think was, at least I didn't think was really possible at first.
Yeah, and I think that from there, what we've realized is that while again not every car, the majority of cars, I think a really easy way to get into like an optimal setup is, the front screws are generally going to be a bigger diameter, whether it's a triangular pod or whether it's a 3-point pod, sorry, it's a little blurry here, or a 4-point pod. Those front screws are going to be generally a bigger screw, and there's a variety of screws, right? There's like the special ScaleAuto screws, the NSR 2.2 screws, those are generally good. And then the rear, we're generally using a thinner screw to allow more movement. And there's obviously like different variations of that. Sometimes we tighten the screw down more to achieve more tension. There was a point at NSR last year where I was trying to tune the car, and through using different amounts of tension, you can achieve a different feel of the cars. You don't necessarily need to go through this elaborate, 2-year process of creating an O-ring dampened car like we did. But generally speaking, that's where we'll start. We'll start with the big head in the front, start with the small head in the rear, and we'll see from there how the car feels.
Yeah. And, we tried that in 2024 at Slot It, thinking we had kind of found the whole tight front screw thing. And it was just that car just didn't like it, right?
Yep.
And so that was one where we really used different screw types to change how much motion the car was allowed to have. And so I don't know if you used NSRs in the front. I know I used NSRs in the front that had that really big, thick stem.
I didn't. So these are, let's see, I am having a lot of trouble getting it to focus, but these are actually ScaleAuto 2.2 like special screws, and then these are Slot It small head screws. But these, I don't think these are necessarily, because my car was pretty tippy as well.
This is an NSR.
Yeah.
And you can see how thick the stem is on that compared to
It's a
this.
chunky boy.
The one on the bottom here is a Slot It. Get that to focus.
We need one of those cameras.
There you go.
Of like back in the day when, in college where they had like the projector camera.
So you could see like the difference.
Oh yeah, that's super clear.
Size on those. And that's what we're talking about. When we say a large diameter and small diameter, it's not necessarily the thread size. It's what that part, that threadless part, how big that is. because that's the part that's in the pod hole for the chassis that's allowing it to move a set distance.
It's determining the distance. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's one of the ways you can control motion. If you are in a really high grip situation and the car likes, having front and rear fully loose or loose in the horizontal plane, you can use the stem type to change how much the front and the back are allowed to move.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, right, you're getting the car is being forced, or the pod's being forced into an advantageous angle that's helping the car to make the turn because you're limiting that front motion.
Exactly. Yeah. And just to show, none of these cars have a ton of movement, but if we imagine again, the car is doing a turn inside here, we're coming up, and then the pod is moving this way. The pod is actually kind of creating four-wheel steering, and it's tracking inside. And when you apply tension to that, you're essentially controlling how you're resisting the change of direction. And I think that's one of the things that gives you that grip is actually that resistance. So it's interesting. I would encourage, if there's one thing that I would say to people watching, it would be go to your local hobby shop, buy a bunch of different screws, and just have like an arsenal of screws, because that was something that I've really amassed over time, is just this collection of 30 different screws in bulk. And it's super advantageous when you're trying to tune a pod, because there's really not much else other than the screws. So the screws are really a critical part of tuning.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's funny. I'm looking at another car that I have sitting here, and this is kind of a funny story. When we got to the end point with this and kind of thought we've got a great understanding of this, and went up to Motown, and I realized, oh, you're allowed to use tape at Motown. The old slot car 32nd scale slot car trick of using tape across the pod. And I think what we ended up backing into here is
so
why do people put tape on the bottom of cars? You see it in a lot of proxy racing. It's huge in that. And I know a lot of people tuned that way, and ultimately you're accomplishing the same thing. It's a really easy, rudimentary way of doing it, but that's exactly what that's doing, right? So you can look at this and see
it's just dampening the movement.
It's just dampening the movement, right? So this tape is resisting that movement. So now it's got a nice, slow, controlled, you're going to lower all the peak forces of the side forces that are going through that tire, which, we talked about earlier, right? Like what makes the tire break away is like a sudden peak force.
Yep.
And not only is it going to make the car easier to drive, the car is actually going to be able to handle more grip because those peak grip levels are coming down. They're being smoothed out.
Yep.
So, I mean, obviously, I think we're probably going to get maybe the most questions we've ever got on any topic in the comments on this one. And we'll certainly spend some time in a future episode, I think, going through those questions and hopefully answering anywhere where it's not quite clear. This is probably one of the more complicated topics in tuning 132nd scale slot cars, and it's one that I've heard a lot of people asking me about when they talk about the podcast. They want us to get into the into the stuff, and this is the stuff, right?
This is the stuff. Yeah, this is the stuff. And it's also, as if, if anybody out there is still with us and not asleep, it is one of those things where it's really complicated and there's not one right answer. And so it tends to be one of those topics at the track where, it's not that you don't want to share, but it's like, do you have an hour? Do you want to, sit down and talk about this? Because there's not one easy answer, and I think
you've got to understand the spectrum. You've got to understand the adjustment in there and how you would adjust it and what it's doing. And hopefully, we've covered a little bit of that in this episode and showing what's actually happening and what adjustments you can make to change that. And that's the biggest thing, is understanding the adjustment. Not just, there is no one magic setting, just like there's no magic car. It's a combination of your driving style, the track conditions, maybe a spec tire that you're forced to have, all those things. And learning to be able to adjust that based on what the car is doing, I think is where everyone should seek to get to.
Yep. So I think that is a pretty good segue into our viewer question. So our viewer question comes from F1 Fletch, and he asks, do you flatten each chassis and or pod assembled or separately? And do you find that you have to do that to every chassis or pod? If I can start, I would say that I pretty much have to flatten 99 out of 100 chassis. And it's not like a manufacturing defect. It's just sort of a byproduct of how they're manufactured and how they're cooled, and a fact that they're mass manufactured. So they have to be like popped in, they're injected in, they're cooled really rapidly, popped out, and then that rapid cooling is what ends up creating that weirdness. And then you have companies that have their cars sitting in hot containers for a month in a little box, tightened down in one spot, and it's a recipe for people like us who are trying to get the maximum out of it. It's kind of a pain in the butt, but at the same time, for a toy car, we are the only people complaining, the 5 out of 1,000 customers. So to answer the question on my end, I flatten every chassis. I don't think there's maybe been one chassis I haven't had to flatten ever. And then for me, I personally like to flatten the chassis and the pod together. And I also go so far as to put the bushings in, to put a dummy motor in, so that all of the tension, when the chassis is being heated, all of that tension goes away, so that once you put the motor in, once you put the axles in, all these things in, there's nothing, they are not changing the geometry or the alignment of anything. So that goes even as far as like grub screws, like I said, bushings, motor, all of those things can tweak a chassis. And my approach is just to take all that out of the equation. What do you do?
Yeah, I think that's like the dead simple, like safe bet, right? Is to have everything installed in the car that you're going to put in the car. I remember early on, I was flattening a racer sideways chassis, and I did it, I think, without the pod in, with none of the parts in, right? Like I flattened the chassis, and then I'm starting to assemble the car, and I'm like, this car is like so twisted, but the chassis was flat when I started, and I got so frustrated with it to the point that I literally took it all apart and started going part by part and putting a part in, putting it on the plate, putting a part in, and finding like, oh, every single screw is causing this chassis to warp in one way or the other. And I think we talked about this on another episode. Even if a screw won't do that, it doesn't hurt to have it in when you flatten the chassis. You're just gonna set yourself up so that that car is going to stay in the position that, the chassis is going to stay flat with all the parts in, and in particular, the front axle grub screws are like the worst culprit in making the front of a chassis droop.
Yeah.
It's guaranteed to happen, honestly, if you don't flatten it with those in and then you put them in. So yeah, I do it on most cars. I will say the chassis that I don't have to flatten have almost all been 3D printed chassis.
Yeah.
And those generally come completely flat. And I think part of that's because the beds are typically heated, and so that cooling happens really slowly. And so you don't get as much of that like tension that happens when you cool things rapidly, because different parts are cooling at different speeds, all that. Yeah. And then the other thing is, some of the pods, like the glass fiber pods, like ScaleAuto has, I tend to not see as much
those are okay,
out of line in those. Really, then it's just like actually using the pod to help keep the chassis, to account for any variations in the chassis. So I would still flatten those assembled. The one exception that I have here is this guy, and this is an NSR triangular pod. This is a ankle winder, but we use the sidewinder ones when we do the NSR race for the Mosler. And you can see that it's got this little like step up here in the back, where it's actually like cut out. What happens with this is that sometimes when they come out of the mold, this is like a little droop down, and that interferes with the pod being able to move inside of the chassis. And you can't always reliably count on the chassis pushing that up. So for these, I actually go so far as to shim under this and flatten the pod completely separately. And it's a pain. And does everyone need to do it? No, but for that race, that's how I've done those, because that's such a critical thing in like how freely the pod can move. Because if it's drooping down, it causes the chassis to bend down in the back. It causes so many issues once you kind of put everything together. But that's something just unique about that.
Yeah, and I would say that having the motor in those pods also helps, because you get in the magnetism of the motor. So the motor helps pull the pod down and keep it flat as well. So, there's kind of like a byproduct of doing that sort of stuff, where one thing actually just benefits another thing, which benefits another thing. And it's a cascading sort of improvement across a board when you do that stuff. Well, that seems like we've covered both topics. There were no jokes made at each other's expense, so it's probably a bit of a boring episode. You didn't make a single joke about my tiny espresso cup, which is just
I
a
didn't
shame.
even notice it. I was too busy just running my mouth. I didn't even notice it.
Geeking out about pods. That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
So next episode, what is our topic for next episode?
We're going to talk about how to achieve different grip levels with the same tire.
Yes, the story of how we came up with the Inter and our different tires. We have an Inter, a Scuff, and a Slick. So that's going to be an interesting one. Yeah, just want to thank you guys again for watching. We will get another episode out as soon as possible. We're trying to make Wednesdays at noon work each week. We're trying our best to make that happen. So just bear with us and be a little patient while we try to get our schedule ramped up. And please don't forget to like and subscribe. And I want to thank our sponsors again. Thank you. And I'll see you guys in the next one.
Hey, guys.